Hello everyone, I'm Jacob Kauf and I'm the nerd on the street, and today we're talking about my NAS. A few years ago, I made a video about adding a ZFS RAID array to the AMD desktop that's sitting behind me. I put three 8TB hard drives into the computer and put them into RAID Z, similar to RAID 5, giving me a total of 16 terabytes of storage and the ability to safely lose one drive without losing any data. That storage pool allowed me to aggregate a lot of loose hard drives that I'd been swapping around before then. The ZFS array is still working well, but I eventually had a couple of problems with it, the first being that I ran out of storage. I've continued making videos and using up more space, and earlier this year, I had less than a terabyte of free space left on that array. Another problem with that array over time has been how I organize my files on it. I basically had one top-level directory per drive for all of those older drives that I'd consolidated, and then one more top-level directory for everything new that was exclusively located on the array. That made it tedious to find files sometimes, because even though I knew generally where to look based on how old the file I was looking for was, a lot of very similar content was split between different directory structures based solely on historical reasons, like when I did a reinstall. I basically had a bunch of different home directories from different points in time organized inside of those different drive directories. So if the thing I was looking for was a document or a picture, I couldn't just go to the documents or pictures folder. I had to know how old it was to know where to look. The organization problem led to some of the data being duplicated over time, which only made the storage problem worse. I've known this was going to get unsustainable eventually, and about a year ago, I started planning this project to build a NAS. NAS stands for Network Attached Storage, and it basically means a computer whose sole purpose is to house hard drives and services for accessing those hard drives, and to make them all available to other computers on the network. Depending on how you configure it, you might also call it a storage server or a private cloud. Now, at the time of recording this introduction, the NAS is actually physically complete, and I've started using it already. But I built this system over the course of several months, a few parts at a time, due to time constraints and to help with budgeting. So in this video, I'm going to take a few minutes to explain the architecture that I chose for the NAS, then we'll look at the first part of putting the hardware together. When I started this project, my goals were very simple. My first priority was longevity, or resiliency. I wanted a system where I could be very confident that I would never lose any data. I have to be prepared for hard drives to fail. I need to be able to replace failed drives with no impact to the data. My second priority was storage space. I already had over 14 terabytes of data, and while I'm not producing as much data as I used to, every time I make a video, it adds dozens of gigabytes to my archive. So I wanted a system that would support a lot of storage and that would be expandable later on. Now, I talked in my previous ZFS video about RAID 5, or the ZFS equivalent, RAID Z. It's a system that uses parity bits to provide a limited level of redundancy, so you can lose 1, 2, or 3 drives without losing any data, depending on how many drives you want to dedicate to redundancy. RAID Z is a good balance between resiliency and capacity. It gives you some room for drive failure, but it doesn't require as many drives as you would need to keep a full second copy of all the data. For that reason, in this new NAS build, I was initially planning to make one giant RAID Z array for all of my data. The problem with that plan is that RAID Z isn't very scalable. If you have 3 drives and you can lose 1, you can lose a third of your drives, and I consider that pretty safe. But if you have 4 drives in a RAID Z array, now you can only lose a quarter of your drives. I wanted as much storage as possible, so I was looking at 8-bay NAS enclosures that would support 8 drives. But RAID Z1 would only let me lose an eighth of my drives. If I lost 25%, 2 drives, then all of my data across all of the drives would be lost. Those odds were past my limit for risk. Now, to offset that, you could use RAID Z2 or Z3, which would allow you to lose 2 or 3 drives respectively. But if you have 8 drives and you're dedicating 3 of them to parity, you're really only getting 1 extra drive's worth of storage compared to if you were doing a mirror or RAID 1 with those 8 drives. With a mirror, every piece of data is located on at least 2 drives. Typically, you have equally sized drives mirrored in pairs. That's what RAID 1 does and what ZFS prefers. BetterFS actually allows using a pool of variously sized drives, and it just makes sure that every block of data is somewhere on 2 different drives in the pool, but that introduces extra complexity and risk. With 8 drives and a ZFS mirroring setup, you're going to have 4 drives with the original data and 4 drives with copies, with no real difference between those original and copy drives. Now, the first big advantage of mirroring over striping with parity is that mirroring uses a lot less CPU power. The system doesn't have to calculate parity bits every time you write to or read from the pool. It just writes the same data to 2 different drives and then picks one or the other to read from. Now with ZFS, the file system still performs checksum verification of the data when you read it. So if one disk has bit rot and the files get corrupted, but the other disk still has valid files, ZFS knows which copy is correct, and it uses that to correct the other one. So ZFS mirroring is just as safe as ZFS striping with parity. You still get the integrity benefits, but you don't have the drawback of having to calculate parity bits. Another advantage to mirroring is that if a drive fails, the resilvering process is just a matter of cloning the remaining drive. When you resilver a parity array, all of the drives are involved because the data is striped across all of them. With mirroring, only the drive containing a copy of the failed drive needs to be read when you're replacing that failed drive. Because the resilvering process is faster due to requiring less CPU, and because it doesn't involve all of the drives, mirroring reduces the risk of another drive failing during the resilvering process. Yet another way that mirrors are easier to work with than parity arrays is that they're easier to expand. Right now, the largest consumer-level hard drives available are 18 terabytes. Both Seagate and Western Digital have announced 20 terabyte hard drives that will probably be available sometime next year, but for right now, or at least earlier in the year when I started researching this, 18 terabytes was the limit. With a RAID Z array, each drive's usable space is limited by the size of the smallest drive in the pool. Actually the VDEV, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So if you have an array of 8 18 terabyte hard drives, you can replace one of those drives with a 20 terabyte drive, and that works fine, but it won't actually give you any more space until you replace the other 7 with 20 terabyte hard drives too. Also, with RAID Z, you can't increase the number of drives after the fact. That's a feature in development. There's actually a pull request open on GitHub for it, but it's been open for a while and it's not currently supported. Now, since we're talking so much about ZFS, I want to mention the difference between a VDEV and a pool. A VDEV, or virtual device, is a group of disks with one of ZFS's RAID flavors applied to it, mirroring Z1, Z2, or Z3. VDEVs are combined into pools and they're always striped. So if you want to use RAID 0, that's striping with no parity, what you're actually going to do is add each drive to a single disk VDEV, then add all of the VDEVs into a pool. Because VDEVs are striped, losing one VDEV means you lose all of the data on the entire pool. With RAID 0, that's expected. Now, when people talk about RAID Z, they're usually talking about using it in a single VDEV. You add 3 or more disks to a VDEV, apply your RAID Z to that VDEV, and then that VDEV is the only VDEV in the pool. So your entire pool is as safe as that VDEV is when it comes to losing drives. Now, it's actually possible to have multiple VDEVs that have their own RAID Z arrays combined into a single pool. Some people recommend that to help with performance bottlenecks and safety, but for the pool sizes that we're talking about, it actually increases your risk. I'll have a visual to help explain that in just a moment. The point of all this is, I decided for this build that for the decreased risk of data loss and easier expandability, it was worth using ZFS mirroring instead of RAID Z. You can always add a VDEV to a pool, so essentially what I was planning on doing was start with a single VDEV with 2 disks, wait until that fills up, then add another 2-disk VDEV, wait until that fills up, and so on. By using ZFS mirroring, I know that my CPU isn't going to be a bottleneck in performance, I'll probably see less RAM usage too, and I'll have an easier time resilvering if a drive ever fails. And the advantage of only adding drives as they're needed is that I'm not locking myself into current hard drive sizes and prices. I fully expect 18 terabyte hard drives to cost less in a few years than they do now. So buying a bunch of 18 terabyte drives today, when some of them wouldn't be needed for a few years, would be a waste. I'd be paying more than I need to, and I'd also be putting a ton of extra stress on those additional drives by having them spun up and working for several years. And of course, I'd be starting with a fixed pool size if I did that, where buying disks 2 at a time as needed, I can take advantage of things like 20 terabyte hard drives once they're generally available. There's one problem with this mirrored VDEV setup. If I had 4 VDEVs of 2 disks, I could lose 1 disk from each VDEV. That's 4 disks. However, since VDEVs are striped, if you lose 1 VDEV, you lose the entire pool. So if I lose only 2 drives, but they happen to be part of the same VDEV, then I've just lost all 8 drives worth of content. When you split your pool up between VDEVs, you're essentially gambling on which drives are going to fail at the same time, which of course is very risky. Using a different brand for each drive in the mirror, which I did, can limit the risk of both drives in the mirror failing at the same time. In my previous ZFS build, I used the same brand and model of drive, but I at least ordered from 3 different retailers to spread the manufacturing dates out. But still, if 2 drives are mirrored, they're essentially going to be sharing the exact same workload. So if one drive fails, it's conceivable to think that the remaining drive would be at an increased risk of also failing. For that reason, I decided to split my disks up not just between VDEVs, but between pools. That essentially means that if I lose a mirrored pair, I only lose the data that was stored on that pair. The rest of my disks are unaffected. The downside of this, ZFS isn't going to automatically load balance my data across the different pools. It does that for VDEVs within a pool, by striping. We remove the stripes, and there's essentially nothing logically connecting those different mirrors together, which is why they're in different pools. For my needs, I decided that was acceptable. In a way, I've actually come full circle. I used to handle my data on different drives, which I would manually pop in and out of a drive toaster sitting behind me on my desk. It was unsafe because I only had one copy of everything, and it was inconvenient because I had to manually, physically move things around to access different files. I realized that even though I started with this grand idea of everything being in one gigantic pool where I would never have to worry about logically separating the data, that's not how I actually used my first ZFS array anyway. Like I said, in the ZFS array on my desktop, I had basically organized in directories based on which older drives the data came from. So I was already separating the data out based on physical size of the drives. The only advantage I got from this array in my desktop was that all of the directories were accessible at the same time, so I never had to physically swap things around. So for this new storage system, I came up with the idea of doing something similar, having data separated by top-level directories. Only this time, those top-level directories would be mount points for different pools. As long as I share the parent directory over the network and I access everything relative to that parent directory, it's essentially going to look exactly the same as if I just had all of those directories in a single pool. But it's going to be safer because if a mirrored VDEV and pool fails, then I only lose that top-level directory's worth of data instead of losing everything. Of course, I don't want to lose any data, and one thing I haven't talked about yet is backups. Everyone always says RAID's not backups. RAID protects you against a drive failing due to wear and tear. It does not protect you against your house burning down. If something physically happens to my NAS, without a backup of that NAS, I would still lose all of the data at once. For my desktop's array, most of the data on there still had copies on their original drives anyway, which are stored in a closet somewhere in a different city, so that data is pretty safe. In my newer data, I was essentially YOLOing. I accepted the risk that, yes, if the array failed, I would lose that data, and I wouldn't die from it. Just like I don't currently back up either of the Samsung SSDs in my desktop. If I lost my videos SSD, I would lose a lot of content, although most of the finished stuff is backed up on YouTube and Vimeo anyway, and my most important files, like my displaced Season 3 directory, I do manually copy to other machines from time to time. I accepted that risk for the array, but it's still not something I felt great about. Now, one of the challenges of offsite backups for a gigantic 70+ terabyte array is that the backup storage medium needs to be able to handle just as much storage as the original array. That would mean either a second array, which would be pretty expensive even if it didn't have as much redundancy, or some kind of cloud solution, which would introduce privacy and security concerns. I realized while figuring all this out that by separating my data into different mirrored pools, I was making my backup job a lot easier as well. Because to back up my mirrored pool of two 18 terabyte drives, I would just need a third independent 18 terabyte drive. And to back up the second pool of 20 terabyte drives in the future, I'll just need a third 20 terabyte drive sitting somewhere else. If I wanted my backup array to not be incredibly fragile, but also not pay for all the same redundancy as the main array, I probably would have had to run it as individual disks anyway, which means I would have had to make a decision about the breakpoints between where backups would go on different disks. But if I'm using separate pools in the first place on the original array, I've already made that decision. The data is already separated on those different pools. It's a massive simplification of a really big problem. And that's essentially what I'm doing with this build. Now, I haven't talked about the software I'm going to use yet beyond ZFS itself, and I will talk about that later in the series, but for right now, I just wanted to give a rundown of my thought process when I was designing this NAS, so that you understand why I'm doing it this way, and what things you might want to consider when you're designing your own NAS. Now, just in case I've lost you along the way, I'm going to quickly cut to the desktop and demonstrate visually some of the things I've mentioned. Alright guys, and here we are on the desktop. This is just a simple chart I made to visually demonstrate an 8-bay NAS, and we're going to be taking a look at how virtual devices and pools and our RAID type all work together to give us the end result of our array. So to start with here, we have a very simple setup. This is one VDEV in RAID Z1, so essentially RAID 5. As you can see, like I said, I'm assuming we have 8 bays in our NAS, and all of those are going to be populated with 18 terabyte hard drives. Once again, you cannot add additional drives to a RAID Z1 array after the fact. So if we were going to do this, we'd want to populate all of the bays with the largest hard drives we can get these days, which is 18 terabytes. So if we just throw all of these into a single VDEV and then put that one VDEV into a single pool, we're going to end up with 126 terabytes of storage. Now, RAID Z1 means that we are sacrificing one drive to act as parity. So we can lose exactly one drive from this array. So out of our 144 physical terabytes that we have, we've got 126 terabytes of usable space, and this array can survive losing up to one drive. If we lose 0 drives, we're obviously okay. If we lose one drive, we're okay, because if it's the parity drive, we don't need it anyway. And if it's any of the other drives, then the system can use the parity drive to rebuild the missing drive. So we can survive losing up to one drive. However, if we lose 2, if we happen to lose 1 at first and then a second one while we're resilvering, or even if we just lose 2 at the same time, we lose the entire VDEV, which means we lose the pool and all of our data. So that's not very safe. Now let's take a look at what RAID Z2 does. In this setup, we are sacrificing 2 drives to parity, or just utilizing 2 drives for the parity. And this is very simple. It just decreases our usable space by 18 terabytes because we are going from 1 drive to 2 that we're allocating to the parity. In exchange for giving up another 18 terabytes of storage, we can now lose up to 2 drives. In RAID Z2, we can lose 1 drive, we're okay. 2 drives, we're still okay. However, if we lose 3 drives, once again, we will die. The array will fail, and we will lose all of our data on the entire VDEV and the entire pool. So the safest way that we can do RAID Z with this many drives is with RAID Z3, and this is the maximum number of drives that we can allocate to parity with RAID Z. In RAID Z3, we're going to dedicate 3 drives to our parity bits. That means we only have 90 terabytes of usable space now. However, we're looking a lot safer here because we can survive losing up to 3 drives. So if we lose 1, we're okay. If we happen to lose 2 at the same time, we're still okay. If we lose 1, and then while we're resilvering from replacing that one, we lose a second one, we don't even have to start sweating because we can lose up to 3 at the same time and all of our data is still intact. However, once again, we will die 100% after losing 4 drives. So if we lost half of our array, we would lose the VDEV and therefore the pool. Now, all of these examples had 1 VDEV in 1 pool, but what happens if we want to add more than 1 VDEV? Is that worth doing? Well, let's take a look. What if we have RAID Z1, but we split it between 2 VDEVs? So we've got one RAID Z1 VDEV and then another RAID Z1 VDEV. These are 2 separate RAID arrays. They're going to be combined into the same ZFS pool. Is that a good idea? Well, let's take a look at the numbers. Our usable space is 108 terabytes. So just for a baseline, once again, we're allocating 1 drive from our first VDEV to parity and 1 drive from our second VDEV to parity. So that's 2 drives we're allocating. So the usable space is going to be equal to RAID Z2, 108 terabytes. However, you see the difference is, just like in RAID Z2, we can survive losing up to 2 drives because if we lose 1 drive in the first VDEV, that VDEV's still okay, and we can lose a second drive as long as it's in the second VDEV, that VDEV is still okay, and as long as both VDEVs are still running, our pool is still good. However, the gotcha here is that, as you can see, if we go back to RAID Z2, we know for sure that we're going to die after losing 3 drives, but we also know for sure that if we lose any 2 drives, our VDEV will still be okay and our pool will still be okay. Compare that to RAID Z1. We say we could die after losing as few as 2 drives. Once again, if we lose, say, drive 1 and drive 5 here, those are in separate VDEVs, so we don't lose anything. However, let's say that drives 1 and 2 fail at the same time. Well, that kills our first VDEV. The second VDEV, the RAID array, is still running. However, these 2 VDEVs are striped, so this pool can no longer access any of its data because that first VDEV went down. So if we lose drive 1 and drive 2, or drive 1 and drive 3, or even if our second VDEV is the one that fails, let's say we lose drive 7 and 8 at the same time. Once again, even if the other 6 drives are all okay, even though these 4 drives in the first VDEV are okay, if this second VDEV goes down due to losing 2 drives at the same time, because this is only RAID Z1 that we're using, the VDEV goes down, the entire pool goes down, and so we are taking the same amount of space as we did with RAID Z2, and we're actually making it riskier because now we have to gamble, well, which ones of these drives are going to fail at the same time? Now, are there situations where some people might want to do this? Maybe. One advantage to having separate VDEVs here is that when you're resilvering a VDEV, only the disks in that VDEV are going to be utilized in that process. So these are very large drives, and RAID Z is actually kinder to the drives when it's resilvering than most hardware or other software RAID 5 implementations. For example, RAID Z typically doesn't have to resilver empty spaces on the drives. It only resilvers where there's actually data, which can save a lot of wear and tear. But still, these are pretty large drives, and so if you're having to resilver an 8-drive configuration here, once again, you might be a little worried about after drive 8 fails and you replace it, the other 7 drives are now much older than drive 8. They're all the same age, and one of them just failed, so how many more are going to fail in the process of recalculating all of that parity? With RAID Z1 across 2 VDEVs, you are cutting down a little bit on how harsh that resilvering process is going to be, because let's say that drive 8 fails in this configuration, the resilvering process isn't even going to touch the first 4 drives. Those 4 are still operating on their own. When you're resilvering the new drive 8 after you replace that, it's only going to have to calculate based on drives 5 through 7, so you're not hammering the other 4, which could save some wear and tear on your drives over time. However, by and large, going by worst case scenarios here, which is what I was trying to plan for, was a worst case scenario. Once again, our minimum number of drives to kill the array in RAID Z2 would be minimum of 3 drives to actually kill the array, but in RAID Z1 across 2 different VDEVs, we could kill it with as few as 2. Now let's see how this actually scales. What if we have RAID Z1 across 3 VDEVs? Now, I wasn't planning on putting 9 drives in my system, at least not right away. Even when I was planning to potentially populate 8 bays at the same time, I was not planning to do that with 9 drives. But what if we did? What if we had 3 different VDEVs? Will that actually decrease our risk at all? Well, let's take a look. As you can see, we've just added an 18 terabyte drive. We now have a drive number 9 here in bay number 9. However, our usable space is still only 108 terabytes. That's the same amount of usable space as we had with 8 drives. So what does that extra drive actually get us if it's not getting us any more space? Well, as you can see, we can now survive losing up to 3 drives. And this is actually the same number of drives that we could lose in our RAID Z3 configuration. And RAID Z3 was only giving us 90 terabytes of usable space. Our RAID Z1 across 3 different VDEVs actually gives us 18 terabytes more space, 108. So what's the catch there? Well, as you can see, we can still die after losing as few as 2 drives. Once again, just like with our previous setup, if we have 3 different VDEVs, we could lose drive 1, 4, and 7 all at the same time, and none of these VDEVs are going to go down. They're all in RAID Z1, so they can all handle losing a single drive. And once again, these are all in the same pool, so ZFS is going to be balancing our data. We don't have to worry about which one of these it's going on. It's all just automatic. We throw it in the pool, and it's distributed across all of these VDEVs by striping. But the downside, of course, is that if we happen to lose 2 drives in the same VDEV, once again, drive 1 and drive 2, if we lost both of those at the same time, that would kill our first VDEV. And if that VDEV is gone, that kills our entire pool as well. It does not matter that VDEVs number 2 and 3 are still running. VDEV number 1 is gone. This pool was striped between the 3 VDEVs. And so if we lose a VDEV, we lose the entire pool. So we are helping our best case scenario here by giving us an extra drive that we could potentially lose compared to 2 VDEVs, or we're giving ourselves more space compared to RAID Z3, but when we're adding an extra drive, spending more money, using more electricity, our worst case scenario is actually worse than with RAID Z3, and it's the same as we had with 1 less drive and 1 less VDEV. We can still kill our entire pool just by losing 2 drives, depending on which ones they are. So once again, it's a gamble. Now, I didn't want to be gambling. That's not how I wanted to build this NAS. And so, like I said, I switched over to a mirror setup. So we're going back down to 8 bays, and we saw that our RAID Z1 split across 2 different VDEVs was not really a great option. So we're going to compare this mirroring setup with the next best, which was our RAID Z3 option when it comes to a balance of usable space and being able to survive losses. Now, as you can see, we're giving up even more of our space in the mirroring setup. We only have 72 terabytes of usable space. So we're dedicating more and more of our drives to parity, which does mean this this array is getting more expensive per gigabyte or per terabyte when we switch to mirroring. However, we can see now that we can lose up to 4 drives. Back when we were in RAID Z3, we knew for sure that we would die after losing 4. We lose 3 drives, we're okay. We lose a 4th drive at the same time, which probably isn't very likely, but if it happened, it would kill our entire pool. And once again, when we're replacing the failed drives, it's going to be stressing all of the drives. So we are increasing the risk of that happening by using parity. Over in our mirroring setup, we can lose a drive from each of our VDEVs at the same time. And since these are all just mirrored, drive 1 and 2 are copies of each other, 3 and 4 are copies of each other. If we lose all of our odd drives or all of our even drives, the entire pool is still okay. All we need in this setup is 1 drive per VDEV still running. And another advantage to this, once again, is that when we're resilvering one of these VDEVs, let's say that drive number 8 fails here. When we replace that, all that we're reading from is drive number 7, so we're not stressing the other 6 drives. That's much more efficient than RAID Z, which if we were replacing 1 drive, it would stress the other 7. Here, we're only stressing 1 other drive. And we're also not relying on our CPU, so we're not making our chassis heat up while we're doing this, and we're not worrying about how long it takes our CPU to do this either. It literally just has to clone this drive 7 onto drive 8, and we're back up and running at full capacity. However, as you can see, if you've got a keen eye, this is still not really a great option because we can still die after losing only 2 drives. So if we compare this to our RAID Z1 with 3 VDEVs, this was buying an extra hard drive. So we said this is kind of a ripoff of a deal here because we're buying an extra drive, we're still not getting any extra worst case scenario safety. So we compare that to our mirroring, and yes, we've increased our best case scenario from 3 drives to 4 drives, but we still have our worst case scenario of killing our entire pool with 2 drives, and we've sacrificed a ton of space. If you take a look at that, even our RAID Z1 spread across 2 VDEVs, we have the same worst case scenario, but a lot more space. And so in that way, these split VDEVs might make sense. They might look like they make sense. Once again, whether it's parity that we're using inside of our individual VDEVs or mirroring, and you can actually have one VDEV that's mirrored and another VDEV that's using parity if you have enough drives in the other one. You're just complicating things if you're doing that, but it's perfectly possible. You know, you can combine any types of VDEVs that you want into a pool. But no matter what type of VDEVs you're using, if you lose even one VDEV, you lose the entire pool. In fact, it's even possible to have one VDEV that's 2 drives mirrored and then another VDEV that's only a single drive. Or you could have one VDEV that's 8 drives mirrored and then a second VDEV that's only a single drive. But it's incredibly risky because you're pinning everything on that one drive. If the VDEV with a single drive fails, the entire pool goes down. So I really was getting a little bit paranoid looking at all these numbers, and I wanted to use mirroring. I wanted that worst case scenario of being able to lose half my drives. And I was even prepared to swallow the usable space. You know, 72 terabytes is a lot of storage. And I didn't want to have to spend a ton of money on a really fast processor to worry about parity and a lot of RAM to worry about that kind of thing. Mirroring is a much lighter weight system too, but I just couldn't stomach this worst case scenario of losing the pool after losing 2 drives. And so for that reason, I landed on my final solution, which was mirroring across 4 different VDEVs in 4 different pools. So our usable space is exactly the same. The usable space is determined by what you're doing in your VDEVs, and we're doing the exact same thing. We've got 4 different VDEVs that are going to be mirrored, 2 drives in each VDEV. The difference here is that we are separating the VDEVs out into different pools. So we still have our same best case scenario as we did with our other mirroring setup. If we lose 4 drives, 1 in each VDEV, we will lose absolutely no data. As long as we have 1 drive in each of these VDEVs remaining, we will have a copy of all of our data remaining. And keep in mind, when a drive does fail, you're going to probably replace it pretty quickly. You're not going to let it run off of the lone remaining drive for a really long time. So those are really, really good odds. All of our data is safe. All of our data is copied between 2 different drives. But what if the worst does happen? What if we lose drive 1 and drive 2 at the same time? And what if we lose this VDEV? Well, the big advantage to using separate pools, like I said, is that when we lose a VDEV, we lose this pool. but these 3 other pools are unaffected now because they are not in the same pool. That's the beauty of this system. As you can see, could die after losing. I've set it to NA here because yes, we can absolutely lose data if we have 2 drives in the same VDEV die at the same time, but 75% of our drives are still going to be okay. 75% of our data is still going to be okay because these are all acting entirely independently. Now, the big drawback to this, once again, is that I'm going to have to make manual decisions on which pool to put different amounts of data. When you're using different VDEVs in a single pool, you just worry about the pool, you put your files in the pool, and it's striped automatically between your different VDEVs. Even if the VDEVs are different sizes, ZFS is still going to balance that out for you so you don't have to worry about it. With separate pools, we are going to appear to our operating system to have 4 different 18 terabyte volumes in this case, because these VDEVs are entirely mirrored and the size we're using here for each drive is 18 terabytes. So it's going to be 18 terabyte volume number 1, 18 terabyte volume number 2, and so on. Like I said, that's something I was willing to compromise on. If I'm going to compromise on something, I would rather it be convenience instead of cost or safety. Safety was the most important factor here. Resiliency, longevity was my most important factor. The second most important thing was the storage capacity, which 72 terabytes is still pretty large in my opinion. The third priority was price, and we're really not spending a ton extra here. We're giving ourselves a single backup for each one of these, which is pretty frugal. You know, you could do this with 3 different 3-drive mirrors, and you could add 4 more drives to your system if you've got a 12-bay system. That way you could lose 2 drives from a single VDEV and still have the third one left. So if you're really paranoid, then you could do that. The reason I'm not doing that, once again, is because this pool system also makes it easy to decide how to back this up. All I have to do is get another system somewhere else, attach an 18 terabyte drive to it for each pool, and then this pool number 1 can back up to backup drive number 1. Pool number 2 can sync with backup drive number 2, and so on. And so in that way, when I get the backup set up, I will essentially have 3 drive mirrors for each of these pools. It's just one of them is going to be located on a different machine, not managed by the same ZFS instance as this initial mirror is. So the intention is that these mirrors protect me very robustly against random drive failure, and then my backups protect me against spontaneous combustion of the chassis or anything weird like that. And while I was editing this clip, I actually thought of one more thing that I wanted to address, another possibility here that is not the one that I chose, but that might be useful for you. I'm comparing here mirror VDEVs with RAID Z1 arrays, but you can combine different VDEVs that are RAID Z2 or Z3 as well. For example, if we have 2 RAID Z2 arrays with 4 drives each, that's actually going to be pretty comparable to what I'm doing with my mirroring setup, and it is going to have some advantages. As you can see, the amount of usable space is exactly the same, 72 terabytes. With our mirroring setup, we had 1 drive from each of our 4 VDEVs that was dedicated to redundancy, so that's 4 drives. With 2 RAID Z2 VDEVs, we're going to have 2 drives from each of these VDEVs that is dedicated to parity. So once again, the total amount of drives that we're dedicating to redundancy or parity is 4, so the exact same amount of usable space. Once again, we can survive losing up to 4 drives. Now, what's the advantage here? Well, over here in our mirroring setup that I'm using, like I said, if I do lose both of my drives in a single VDEV, I will lose the data in that pool. I'm okay with that because of the backup system I'm planning, but maybe you don't have a backup system. Maybe you are wanting everything to be in one box. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but if that's what you're planning, take a look at this RAID Z2 setup. Now, if we lose any 2 drives, we'll still be okay. If we lose drive number 1 and number 5, that really doesn't do anything because they're in separate VDEVs. But even if we lose drives 1 and 2, or 7 and 8 at the same time, as long as we don't lose 3 drives in the same VDEV at the same time, the VDEV is still okay. So by doing this, you can actually still have a single pool if you don't want to have to worry about manually organizing your files between the different pools like I'm going to do. If you wanted to have this many drives in a single array, this would probably be the safest way to do it. Because when we had just 4 mirrored VDEVs in a single pool, once again, we could die after losing as few as 2 drives. With this RAID Z2 setup across 2 different VDEVs, any 2 drives, it's going to be safe to lose. So our minimum to kill the array is going up to 3 drives. And because of that, this is very similar to our RAID Z3 array, which would also allow us to lose up to 3 drives. For that extra drive that you're giving up, you get a little bit more safety because we can actually lose up to 4 with our RAID Z2 across 2 different VDEVs, so it's safer in that way. So if you wanted everything in a single pool and you wanted 8 drives, this is honestly how I would do it, and that's why I wanted to go back and record an extra clip for this section, because I realized I hadn't talked about that. Of course, if you do want to split your pools up the way that I'm doing, but maybe you don't want to be quite as fragile where only losing 2 drives will lose some of your data, you can also split the pools up between 2 different Z2 VDEVs. This is going to have some of the same benefits and drawbacks as my mirrored system with split pools. You're going to have to manually balance your data between pool number 1 and pool number 2. However, these are at least larger pools, so you don't have to worry about that organization quite as much. And once again, losing any 2 particular drives will not lose any data in this setup like it will in my own setup, because with these RAID Z2 arrays, if we lose drives 1 and 2, once again it would kill my first pool here if that happened. 1 and 2, losing those in a RAID Z2 setup with 2 pools would also not lose any data. And splitting the pools instead of not splitting the pools has the advantage of being able to lose one of the pools if we did happen to lose all 3 drives at the bottom here. In our RAID Z2 setup, if we lost 3 drives in a single VDEV, it would still kill our pool, whereas RAID Z2 across 2 different pools, if we lost 3 drives, it would kill this second pool, but it wouldn't kill the first pool. So that's sort of a compromise between what I'm doing and what might be a more optimal setup. Now, why didn't I go with this if it's a more optimal setup? Once again, a few different reasons. For one thing, I didn't want to have to worry about calculating that parity. And the more drives that you have being used for parity, the greater the calculations are. So RAID Z2 is going to be heavier on your NAS hardware than RAID Z1. Another reason I wasn't particularly bothered by having the pools split up, once again, was to ease that backup situation. If you put everything in the same pool, if you're wanting to back up to another system, I wouldn't build another array. I don't want a striped array or something weak like that for my backup system either, so I would be backing up to individual drives anyway, because once again, I don't want to spend all that money on redundancy for the backup system. The backup's supposed to be a backup, just the bare minimum to have a somewhat confident ability to restore my data if I absolutely need to. If I was using a single pool, I would either have to build an array to do that, or I would have to split the data up for the individual drives that I'm backing up to anyway, where with my mirrored setup split across different pools, that decision has already been made, the data is already split up. And finally, like I said, these smaller pools make expandability easier. I am on a little bit of a budget, so by building my pools with only 2 drives each, I can get up and running now with 2 drives. I can throw 2 18 terabyte hard drives in there. It limits my upfront expense. And then next year, when 20 terabyte hard drives are available, once I run out of space on the first pool, I can add a second pool, and I only have to pay for 2 more drives. I don't have to add 4 more at a time. Pricing wise, this is easiest to get started, and capacity wise, this is also the most future proof. So hopefully that clears up my thought process when I was deciding on this setup. And with all of that explanation out of the way, we're finally going to start unboxing and putting together the hardware for this build. Now, I'm going to talk about each of the parts individually as I unbox them, but just to give you a broad overview of the hardware that I chose, my priorities once again were longevity, expandability, and price, in that order. I started by looking at dedicated NAS appliances and then shifted my focus to parts to build my own. And for the chassis, I ended up landing on the Fractal Design Node 804 case. Now, I did consider several dedicated NAS chassis options, such as the Silverstone CS381, the Silverstone DS380, some iStar and Rosewell hard drive adapters for towers with lots of 5¼ drive bays, and even some cheap Chinese options from AliExpress that would have supported up to 12 drives. The problem with those dedicated NAS cases were that most of them had really bad cooling. A NAS chassis tends to put all of the drives right next to each other with not a lot of space for air to flow in between. If not all of the drives, they're usually at least bunched up in groups. That leads to higher temperatures, which leads to decreased longevity, which meant that they were incompatible with my #1 goal. The Node 804 that I'm about to unbox has much better cooling than any of those dedicated NAS options. After I unbox the case, I'm also going to talk about the motherboard, processor, operating system SSD, and power supply in this video. I unboxed and installed these parts over time as they came in, so the editing was a little tricky here, and I hope this isn't too disjointed. But without further ado, let's get into the build. Alright guys, so here we have the case of the NAS, and this is the Fractal Design Node 804. I decided to unbox this part before any of the other components get here because Newegg delivered this today, and I ordered through Newegg Newegg business, and when they delivered, they decided to leave it in a common area of my apartment complex, completely unsupervised. The tracking on their website says that they left it in a locker, which is a lie. It was really just sitting next to the lockers, which I'm very unhappy about. Now, as you can see on this side of the box, where one of the two handles for the box is, you can see the actual case right in there. In this entire box, I mean, it's plastered all over it that it's a computer case. So it would have been very easy for anybody to steal where it was left. And this side of the box is a little bit torn up. Sort of this flap that can open up here from that handle, you can see the box was really beat up on this side, but then on the opposite side, the handle hasn't even been punched out of the cardboard there. So I'm thinking this will probably be okay. There's another ding on the box down here. If it's not okay, then hopefully the reason I ordered through Newegg Business instead of regular Newegg is because the business sites sometimes have better customer service. But yeah, that is off to a very bad start with their customer service, just leaving the package in a public area, nowhere near my apartment door, all the way on the other side of the apartment complex. But that's why I'm opening this up, is so that I can see if I need to open a claim on Newegg's website for this or not. So we will go ahead and open this up here. And one thing I'm already pleased about with this box is how small it is. Because the box, I was basically able to carry it in one arm when I was bringing it into my apartment, which means that the case itself will be even smaller and easier to carry. So let's open this box up here. All right, and I'm going to tilt it down this way so that it's facing the camera. And it looks like this will also put it in the correct orientation when we slide it out of the box here. It's in two pieces of styrofoam, one on each side, or rather one on the top and one on the bottom. The case was kind of packed into the box sideways. So we'll just slide that right out. The box is completely empty now, so we can set that off to the side. So we'll take the top piece of styrofoam off here, set that over with the box, and we will lift the case up from the bottom piece of styrofoam. I'm just gonna turn it upside down for a second. I can hear things moving around in there. So my primary concern with the box being broken was whether or not any dings would be on the outside of the case, and then also whether any of the accessories would be missing. Since it is in a plastic bag, the plastic bag is not torn up or anything. And the accessories, it looks like they're all inside the case, or at least inside this plastic bag here. So I think we might be okay. We've got a plastic bag here. It's the Node 804 user guide, which I will take a look at before we start putting any components into this thing. And then here, still upside down, we have the case itself. So I'm going to slide the plastic off as much as I can there, and then we will... All right. Yeah, they just threw some boxes and things loose in there, which, considering it was packed sideways, the boxes were actually sort of hitting up against the fans in the back of the case, so I could see fan damage occurring there, especially if they're transporting it roughly enough for the box to be that beat up. So my whole thing here, this isn't really a fractal design thing, but yeah, Newegg, I used to really prefer them over other retailers, but I really don't feel bad anymore about ordering from Amazon instead of Newegg. But let's take a look here. Let's take a look. So we've got some plastic over the side glass here. It looks like maybe, yeah, there's a piece of plastic on the outside and then one more on the inside. All right. So my initial impressions of this case before we open it up, like I said, I really do like the size. It is, as you can see, it's like half the height of my desktop back there, maybe a little bit more than half. And I do have a fairly large desktop. I've got a full ATX case, which I like to do when I'm building desktop computers. And that's not just for fun, I'm utilizing a lot of that space. I've got a water cooling radiator, I've got 2 GPUs, 3 spinning hard drives, an optical drive. I really am using the full ATX case. But for this machine that's just going to be housing hard drives, I think this small form factor is going to work out really well. Now, obviously, some dedicated NAS cases from companies like Silverstone might be even smaller, but then you're trading off airflow with those. So let's move this back over here. And yeah, the feet are all sitting on the table just fine. It's not wobbling or anything. I felt it wobble when I set it back there, but that was because it was sitting on top of the user manual. So on the right side of the case here, we've got that window that will be a lot more clear when we take that second layer of plastic off. On the back here, all right, on the back, we've got our dual chamber design already visible because on the right side, we've got a cooling fan for the CPU or just general airflow on this side of the case. And then we also have our expansion card slots. And those expansion card slots, these are normally at the bottom left of a computer case. But here in this case, they're actually halfway over to the right because there's a metal partition through the middle of this thing. And on the left side here, this is where our hard drives are going to go, which makes this perfect for a NAS case. The fact that the hard drives have their own dedicated air chamber, the only piece that they're sharing this side of the case with is the power supply that goes down here. And the power supply is fairly enclosed in terms of its cooling and whatnot. On the right side, we have an entirely blank panel, so you don't have any hot swap with this case. That's the one trade-off you make going with the Node 804 over a dedicated NAS case is the lack of hot swap. And you also don't get any sort of window to look into your hard drives. Now hard drives, they don't do anything flashy, even though they do mechanically move on the inside. They're typically not transparent, so it's not like a hard drive is that interesting to look at. But if your hard drives catch on fire, then you will not see it because there is no window on this side of the case. All right, moving this. Oh, and by the way, here on this side, we do have two USB 3.0 ports down here, which for a NAS is very handy if you need to locally transfer storage in or out of this thing. Of course, our motherboard's going to have a Thunderbolt port on it, which is going to be a lot faster than USB 3.0, but it is nice that these are here on the front for easy access. We have our power button right there. We've got audio input and output. This thing is built so that you can use it for a regular old computer if you want to. It doesn't have to be a NAS. And along those lines, we do have a slot loading optical drive as well. Now, this probably wouldn't be too useful in a NAS, but honestly, what I normally do with optical media, I still buy DVDs every now and then because I like to have maybe commentaries or things like that that you can only get on DVDs or Blu-rays. But what I normally do is I buy those and then I rip them on my computer and then I put them on a shelf for display, but I don't actually use the optical media for the rest of the time that I own that. So even though I'm using this as a NAS, if I ever wanted to put a slot loading optical drive in there, it would be kind of nice that I would be able to rip my media directly to the NAS, since that's where it's going to end up being stored anyway, and just cut out the step of having to use a separate computer to do the ripping. That is an option. So we will rotate this thing so you can see the front of it right there. Now this is an interesting design. I do wonder about airflow, but the airflow, everybody said in reviews that the airflow was great. Now, as you can see, a large portion of this front panel, this is just plain, solid metal. Here, you can't see me that well anyway, so I've just zoomed the camera in so you can get a better look at the case. So most of this is a metal. It's very thin metal. It does feel like metal and not plastic. It's pretty cool to the touch. Whereas the top frame of this, I can feel that this part's plastic. This front panel, it does feel like actual metal. It does have a nice sort of brushed look to it. It's got vertical lines kind of going across it. Just a nice unintrusive Fractal Design logo in the bottom right. And then here at the bottom, we have a dedicated vent. And I just running my fingers over this, I can feel that it's not entirely smooth. I don't think it's actually dinged up from transport. Bending metal is difficult, so I wouldn't necessarily expect a completely smooth airflow grill here. But this is an intake grill for air to go into the case, and I would expect there to be some sort of dust filter behind this, since the front of the case is typically going to be intake. So we'll move this thing so that the side of it is facing you again, the side with the window. Let's go ahead and take the screws off of this thing. And even though these are thumb screws, they are screwed in too tightly to unscrew with my fingers. So I'll go ahead and grab my knife again, and I will collapse the knife, bring out my screwdriver here. I have used Fractal Design one time in the past, and that was, you can actually go back, I think, and find the videos when I helped my friend Michael Chanot build a server in his room. That was years ago. I don't remember, that might not have been the time that we used a Fractal Design case, but I think it was, and I remember that I did not like working with it. My current case is a Fantex case, and I would absolutely recommend Fantex to anybody looking to build a full-size desktop computer. This case is a joy to work with. The case that I used in my own personal desktop, I don't think it was Antec, but it was some cheap brand off of Newegg because I was very young when I built that first computer and didn't have a very large budget. But it was also fairly nice to work in, fairly toolless. I remember the Fractal Design case that I worked with being fairly, not necessarily bad to work with, but it definitely required tools, and it required, it was a lot of metal on metal type of stuff. It wasn't a very smooth experience. like I prefer my desktop cases to be. But this thing is basically going to be a utility. The only real concern in terms of ease of use is other people being able to change out hard drives for me if they should fail while I am not around to change them out. But we are going to go ahead and peel off the other side of the plastic there, so that is a much clearer window, as you can see. And the window is a decent size, not quite as sharp as the edge-to-edge glass look that my Fantex case back there has. And I believe, yeah, that's plastic, that's not glass, which is nice because plastic is a lot lighter and more durable. Once again, I don't even need a window on this thing necessarily. It's not going to have any flashy graphics cards in it or anything like that. So that is perfectly sufficient, just for being able to see, I guess, the CPU fans, make sure everything in this side of the case at least is spinning. So down here at the bottom of the case, we've got a nice heavy box that has a decent amount of weight to it. Grabbing the knife again, and I pulled out a different blade this time, which was unintentional. But inside of this box, it looks like we have brackets. It looks like those are actually the brackets for the hard drive cages, which is interesting. I was expecting them to be pre-installed on that other side of the case. Technically, the hard drive setup, those cages are optional. You can put other things on the other side of this if you want to, I believe. I'm not sure exactly what you would stick in there other than hard drives, but I do know there are other configurations for this that aren't NAS configurations. So we've got the rails that are going to attach to either side of a hard drive, I would assume. We've got rubber shock absorbers that will help isolate the hard drives from each other and from your environment. And in here's what I was expecting the most. I wasn't expecting those rails to be in there. But inside of this smaller bag, we've got a ton of screws. Make sure to not accidentally dump all of those out. So these are going to be screws for your power supply, your hard drives. The motherboard screws will probably come with the motherboard, but I definitely see at least the power supply and hard drive screws in there. So nice hefty bag there. I'll have to count to see if they're all actually there, because there's no way I can tell that just by looking at these bags. Here, I'll just tilt the camera down even more. Like I said, you can't see me anyway. So here we've got, it looks like, probably a bracket to help keep PCI Express devices in place on the machine. And then we do get a few zip ties. I don't normally like using zip ties. I prefer, when I do cable organize, I would probably prefer Velcro strips, but I don't have any Velcro strips. And this is sort of a budget build, so I might use some of these zip ties because I do like making my machines look nice these days when I'm able to do so. So all of that is there, and then inside of the case we've got some wiring. We've got a bread tie holding together the case's wiring, and that wiring would consist of our USB 3.0 header, I believe is that large blue one. We've got our audio header, is this smaller one. Yep, HD audio it says. These two smallest little wires, this would be for our power switch. No, these are LEDs. Okay, so the one that has the two wires stuck together, that's our hard drive LED wire. And then the wires that are separate, those are the power LED wires. Looks like there is more cabling back here. Okay, so the fan cables are all individually twisty tied together with each of the fans, which is kind of nice. And right inside of here, I'm not sure how well you can see that, but in the back here, there is the built-in fan controller. It's a 3-speed controller, I believe, which would just be a manual. Yeah, here on the back of the case, there's a switch. So you can literally set the fans to low, medium, high, just with that switch on the back. Not the most responsive thing, maybe not the most ecologically friendly thing. I might see if my motherboard's able to accommodate the fans. If I need to get Y cables, I might. I will give the built-in fans here a try because, you know, some cases such as Roswell or Antec, super cheap cases, I would definitely want to replace the fans from the get-go for a stability machine like this. But Fractal Design, they typically do okay with their built-in fans, so I might leave them in there for a while. I'm not going to replace them all with Noctua fans right away or anything. I might do that in the future, but for a budget build, when I'm going to be around to maintain this thing at least for a little while, I will go ahead and see how these fans perform, how they move air, and how they sound. But yeah, it will be interesting to see what I end up setting the speed to there if I use that built-in fan controller. So I will just come to the other side here, and I want to take a look at the hard drive mounting setup, since that's obviously what we're using this case for. And I am still looking around the whole case. Fortunately, it does look like it is unharmed despite the sitting in a public location with no supervision for several hours and having its box torn up either before or after being deposited there. Despite all of that, the case is in good condition, it looks like, or at least decent condition. I don't know what their tolerances are in terms of manufacturing. Here in the back, the metal piece here that is in between the power supply hole and the PCI Express slots, this metal piece is sort of bowed out of the machine, sort of bowed that way, away from the back of the machine. So like if this were a Mac Pro tower, I would not expect that sort of bowing, that flexing. But you know, for a regular PC case, I mean, I wouldn't really expect that for my Fantex case back there either. But for a Fractal Design case, it is about what I expected, and at least it's metal and not plastic, because it feels and looks nicer and will be slightly more safe to carry around and transport. Okay. So we will grab that other side off of the case. So in here, this is where our hard drive cages are. And I'll get you guys better views of this when we're actually putting the hard drives in later. But yeah, it looks like we do have some stabilizers already inserted in here. But yeah, the screws for each hard drive are not pre-installed. So we have 2 drive cages here that can hold 4 3.5-inch drives each. There are also a couple of other places you can stick 3.5-inch drives in here for a total of 10 that are officially supported. And if we just loosen a couple of these screws, every single one of these are over tightened. What's the point of including thumb screws if you're going to over tighten them to the point where a screwdriver is required? I really don't get it. But if we go ahead and unscrew the 2 screws for the front drive cage, once those screws are removed, the drive cage does not just fall down. This is information that I had a hard time telling just by looking at pictures. I had to find some other videos to find this out. You're not going to be bumbling around with trying to hold the drives up while you're screwing it in. The drive cage does hold itself up on this rail, so the screws just hold the drive cage in place so that it doesn't slide around on the rail, but it is on a rail, so we just slide it off the rail, and now we have our loose drive cage that we can put our drives into. Every single one of these holes that you see, this holds 4 drives. You see 3 holes. Those are actually going to be spaces in between the drives, which once again is really good for airflow, to have some space in between the drives where that air can go and dissipate heat. In a lot of NAS cases, you get drives that are stuck right up against each other, and there's nowhere for air to even go in between the drives, so you get a lot of heat buildup on your inner drives. This case, it's going to be much less of a problem thanks to all of these holes in between the drives and the space that it creates between them. Of course, another reason why the airflow will be good in this thing is because we have our 2 drive cages, and in the front, we've got this vent on the bottom that's going to feed air into the entire, I feel a dust filter that kind of encompasses the entire front. So theoretically, we should have air coming in throughout the entire front of the case, and then it's going to exit the case through the entire back of the case, through that fan at the top, and then the power supply fan at the bottom that's going to be part of the power supply when we put that in. With dedicated NAS cases, they usually have back planes to accommodate those hot plugging mechanisms that they have, and those back planes, those are solid planes that typically stop air. I've seen a couple of them on the nicer NAS chassis out there that do have slits in the back planes to allow some airflow through, but some of the back planes are really just solid circuit boards, and you're not getting any air through a circuit board. So the fact that this does not have hot plugging, it really is a huge deal for thermals, which can impact your drive longevity. That's what I'm most concerned about. It can also impact noise if that's something that you're concerned about. So I am excited to build in this case. I haven't ordered the drives yet. Like I said, I've got the motherboard and the processor on their way, and then I still need to order the RAM and power supply as well, although I think I've got them picked out. But yeah, I just wanted to take this thing out of the box. It's August 2nd. I didn't say the date earlier. I just wanted to kind of take a look at it, make sure it wasn't too dinged up. It looks like it's in good condition. I'm going to make sure that I have all the pieces that I would need to throw 3.5-inch drives in here, but as long as I do, it's looking good to me. So I'll see you guys in the next segment. So here we are just a couple days after the case unboxing, and in this box we have 2 components. This is our motherboard and our processor, 2 very important parts of any computer. I'm going to open my knife up here and just slice through our tape. I can see some bubble wrap kind of bulging out here, which kind of indicates that this was packed at a lower altitude than where I'm at here in Denver. And it looks like my address is on both top flaps of this box, so I'm just going to open it up sideways to limit the amount of rotoscoping I'll need to do. Alright, and we have lots of sealed air in here, as you can see. And underneath all of that, we've got our parts. So here at the top, we've got our processor, and this is going to be an AMD build. This is an AMD Ryzen 3 3300X. I had the choice of going between this processor and a basically identically priced Ryzen 5 model that was a generation behind. It was a 2000 series. I went for the slightly newer Ryzen 3 model, and for this build, I didn't want a CPU that was too power hungry. I didn't need the most performant thing in the world, and I didn't need a ton of cores, but I am planning on hosting a few services on this box to allow for my own remote access to some of the files. And for that, plus for just general ZFS stuff, I did want to get a decent processor. A lot of these pre-built NAS systems that you get from places like QNAP, they've got AMD Ryzen processors in them, but they're embedded processors that are very low clock speed, very few cores, and if a drive actually fails in a RAID array that's using parity, let's say RAID 5 or 6 or 7, or RAID Z, Z2, and Z3, a weak processor means that it's going to take longer to resilver the entire RAID array. And if that process takes longer, you're introducing more of a risk of additional drives failing during that process. So you don't want to skimp out on the processor in any important RAID machine. Now, in the case of my NAS here, I'm going to be using mirroring RAID 1, and that's not going to take a lot of CPU power, but I am going to turn compression on with ZFS, and the CPU will help for that. And like I said, just for virtualization of some of the other services, because when I'm opening up anything on this massive NAS, of course, I want that to be as secure and containerized, compartmentalized, I should say, as possible. I'm not planning on using actual containers, but virtual machines to handle some of the outside service hosting I will probably utilize. So on the side here, you can see the actual Ryzen chip sticking out of the box. This is a much smaller box than my Threadripper processor came in, understandably so. This is more economical anyway, and it reminds me of an Intel processor box, although it's still a little bit larger than an Intel CPU box. The Intel one, when I built that Intel machine, that was a Sandy Bridge machine, so very long time ago now. But that box almost felt cramped how small it was. This seems like a good size for a processor box, and you can see there's a picture of a fan on the side. You can tell by the size of the box that there is an included cooler that I'm going to be using to start out. Once again, I don't need a lot of CPU performance. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't stuck with a really low-powered CPU, but in terms of cooling, I'm more concerned about cooling the drives than the CPU, and the case should handle both perfectly fine since the case is partitioned. Let me get that last bit of plastic off of the box so that that's not making noise anymore. And the only other thing in this box is our motherboard. So let me take that out. And here it is. This is an ASRock X570M Pro 4 motherboard. Now, the motherboard in my current desktop is an ASRock Taichi model. I don't remember the exact model number, but it was from their Taichi line, which is a little bit less flashy with the RGB than some of the other models. Now, my desktop computer actually isn't the most stable thing in the world, so I wasn't 100% sure on going with ASRock, but the motherboard hasn't given me any problems, really. The motherboard is still working great in that desktop, and when I looked into warranty service, when I thought the motherboard was having a problem, ASRock was responsive on that. So I feel pretty good about going with an ASRock brand for this. Now, I didn't select this out of a large number of motherboards. There were really only a couple of boards that were in the price range and the feature set that I was looking at. This NAS case can hold up to 10 3.5-inch spinning drives, with 8 of them hanging in the bays as you saw in the previous clip. So I wanted a motherboard that had at least 8 SATA ports. And if you go onto Newegg right now and you just filter your motherboards by number of SATA ports, there are not that many consumer level options that have 8 ports. Now, if I had gone up to a server level motherboard, which ASRock was also the only brand who had the number of ports that I was looking for in the server space, but for their server series, the rack series they called it, those motherboards had 12 SATA ports on some of them, but they were much more expensive. We're talking several $100s more expensive. Whereas this motherboard, it was about $150, about the same price as the CPU. So for about $300, we've got a Ryzen processor and we've got a motherboard to run it on. And this motherboard is no slouch. It does have, like I said, all 8 SATA connectors that I wanted, so I would be able to hook up 8 spinning hard drives directly to the motherboard if I ever wanted to in the future. Now, the reason to go with a 12-port motherboard over an 8-port, even if you're only planning on using 8 of the ports, just thinking ahead, one possible reason would be over-provisioning in case some of the ports fail, or in case the motherboard can't actually handle all of the bandwidth. Theoretically, it should be able to, because it has all 8 ports, and they all should work at the same time. But sometimes when you're stressing a system to its absolute limits, that's when you see more instability than if you're using a system at less than its limits. And so one of the server boards would have been nice, but this, like I said, it has the number that I actually need, and it also has several PCI Express slots. Reading off the back here, it has 2 PCIe 4.0x16 slots and 1 PCIe 4.0 by 1 slot. SATA cards I did look up in case I want to add a SATA card to this machine in the future. They typically use a by 4 slot, so they would take up one of those full-size 4.0 by 16 PCIe slots. But since I'm not planning on keeping a GPU in here long term, I've got 2 basically that are free. And even if I was planning on keeping a GPU in here long term, I still would have 1 PCI Express 4.0 slot to stick a super high-speed SATA connector in there. PCIe 4.0 is not going to be the bottleneck. If you're using a SATA card, SATA itself would be the bottleneck. So that's plenty of expansion for the future. If I ever want to get a 10 gigabit per second networking card, for example, another advantage of the server-grade motherboard over this consumer-grade motherboard is that the server-grade motherboard had 10 gigabit per second Ethernet built in, whereas this motherboard only has 1 gigabit per second Ethernet built in. And some of you might think that that is not very future-proof. Personally, my network is at less than 1 gigabit per second right now. I know on some other channels that have a ton of resources and get lots of free stuff, some people have started building 10 gigabit per second networks to do things like video editing off of a NAS. That is not what this NAS is going to be. My desktop is much more performant than a lot of YouTubers' desktops would be. You know, this desktop is way more performant than any Mac. And it's still going to have a lot of very fast storage inside. Not even counting the 1624 terabyte RAID array in my desktop itself, I've got a 1 terabyte SSD that's my OS drive, and I've got a 2 terabyte SSD that's my video editing drive. Both of those are NVMe. So anything sensitive to speed, I'm still going to be doing directly off of my desktop computer. If I ever need to edit video from the NAS, I'll copy the video over here, edit, and then put it back when I'm done. If I'm doing some huge project where that's not possible, like I'm pulling a lot of clips out of archives, I'm going to be using an editor like Kdenlive or Olive that doesn't require transcoding. And in that kind of a case, I'm going to be okay with lowered performance because that's a one-off special project going through old footage. But in general, I don't need that fast of access to the system. Like I said, the rest of my network is at less than 1 gigabit per second right now. Now, normally when I was accessing footage from my laptop on my desktop computer, I was accessing them over my network, but then it was coming off of a spinning 2.5-inch hard drive in my laptop. And I'm aware the spinning hard drive probably was the bottleneck and not actually the network in that case. But even with the spinning hard drive being the bottleneck, that one single 2.5-inch consumer-grade drive, I was still able to browse video on my computer and scrub fluently within the video. I never had any problems playing back video, so I should have no trouble at all managing files over 1 gigabit per second. But if I ever do want to upgrade, if I ever want to add a 10 gigabit per second Ethernet port, RJ45, or even an SFP Plus port to do some fiber stuff, most of those cards only need a by 1 slot. So the shorter PCIe slot in here would be perfect for that, or I can use one of the other 2 slots that are available. So this motherboard is a little tightly provisioned. It is not super over provisioned. You know, this entire build really is just provisioned to what I realistically need, because I didn't want to break the bank doing this. I wanted to spend a reasonable amount of money getting the best amount of storage that I can get for the price with a reasonable amount of reliability. So we've got a very reasonable processor here. It's 65 watts on the lower end in terms of power consumption. And then our motherboard here, it has only the ports that I actually need. It does have expansion slots if I ever find myself limited in the future. And as you saw, the case totally supports expansion slots, so that should be no problem. So I will just go ahead and open up here the motherboard so you can see it. Here we've got some documentation on the top. We also have an individual bags, screws for each of the M.2 slots, and I'll probably end up taking all of those screws out of the bags and putting them into the slots just so they're there if I ever need them. We've got our RAM order here. As you can see, this board does have 4 RAM slots, so that's less RAM slots than my desktop has, but once again, I'm gonna need a lot less RAM, and we'll talk about the RAM when that comes in a while, because I haven't quite ordered that yet. Here we have a manual, and if we open that up, we do have a driver CD, which I have full confidence includes Linux drivers, of course, right? Well, hopefully we won't need them anyway, so I'll just set that off to the side. We do have an I/O shield, which I am going to attempt to install for this build. I used to be anti-I/O shield, but my desktop has one on it. This one is silver, as you can see. It's not painted matte black like the one on my desktop is, but that's perfectly fine. We do have a SATA cable or two included here. These do have 90-degree connectors. We'll have to see how many SATA cables are in this thing and how long they actually are, because the case is very spacious and we might need some longer cables, but maybe not, we'll have to see. And in here we have the motherboard itself. We'll go ahead and take this motherboard out of the box and loudly slide the box off to the corner of the desk. And I will look for an opening here to open our anti-static bag. All right, good, I don't need to do any cutting, the bag is already open. So I will slide that out. There is some foam on the bottom of this, which is nice because it's never fun pricking yourself on all of the little metal pins coming out of the bottom of a motherboard. But we can go ahead and set this back down, try to get a half decent camera shot here. On the back, you can see the ports that we do have. We even have a PS2 port, which is kind of reminiscent of a server. So if I want to hook up a super cheap keyboard to this thing, just in case of eventual emergency console access, I can do that. But all of the USB ports are 3.0 or above at least, and we do have a Thunderbolt port, which is very nice. The Thunderbolt port I might actually use. Thunderbolt is a really cool port, way more useful than the USB-C port on my desktop is. If I wanted to hook up an eGPU box to this thing and perform Blender renders over my network, for instance, I could easily do that by connecting the eGPU box to the Thunderbolt port. Even though this is a NAS, I wouldn't want to put the GPUs in the box. That would be a great usage of the Thunderbolt port so that I can have the eGPU box in another room away from me because it makes a lot of noise. So this M.2 armor here, that is a cooling system for the M.2 drives. One of the M.2 slots is actually right here, but then the other slot is underneath this cover. And this is a bit of a heat sink and then a fan at the end of it just to dissipate some heat. Here we've got the CPU socket. This is an AMD board, so the CPU is going to have pins on it, and the socket here is just going to be the tiny little holes that the pins will slot into later. So let's go ahead and put the processor in. I'm not going to put the cooling system in right now, but we can go ahead and do the processor. This processor box is sealed with a sort of sticker at the top, which is nice, and I'll go ahead and cut that so we can open this box up. And in this large cardboard section, this is going to be our cooler. And so the cooler, like I said, we'll wait until we're closer to putting this thing into the case before we put the cooler on, I think. But we can open that up. And as you can see, it's just a standard cooler. It looks like it has some pre-applied thermal paste, so nothing to write home about. But it's nice that they include it for builds such as this. You know, this is a Ryzen 3 processor. It's the equivalent of an Intel Core i3. It's the lowest end processor. So you're probably more likely to use an integrated cooler with one of these than you would be with a much higher end processor. In the box here, we do have a plastic tray with the CPU itself in it. So this is very comparable in size to one of the Intel Core processors, much smaller than the Threadripper that I worked with a couple years ago building my desktop back there. We do have a sticker that says Ryzen 3, and that's cool. I'll probably find somewhere on the case to stick that. And in the box, we have a little bit of foam separating things, and we've got, looks like, some installation instructions, warranty information. I am going to keep track of the warranties on this thing, although I have pretty high confidence in the CPU. And as you can see here, this 3000 series of processor actually does require a BIOS update for 400 series motherboards. However, this is an X570M motherboard, which means it's a 500 series, and it does not need any BIOS updates to support the CPU. We'll still check for BIOS updates, but we won't have any compatibility issues with this. So we'll turn this CPU tray over and we'll just open up the plastic there. So there's our CPU. Like I said, let's go ahead and stick it in there just to get that out of the way. I'm going to very carefully grab the CPU. We'll go from this side here. All right, so AMD CPUs have lots of these tiny golden pins. Of course, if you've never put a CPU into a motherboard before, you want to try not to touch any part of the CPU or the socket that you don't need to. I'm just going to open up the socket here by pulling this metal stick up. I'm going to align this so there's a small golden triangle on this corner of the CPU. I can see it in the camera's viewfinder, so I know that you can see it as well. And on the motherboard, I can see a tiny little triangle on the corner of the socket right here in the plastic. Not sure how well you can see that one, but this is going to be the corner that we want to match this corner to. So with that in mind, I will just All right, so I just carefully lined those pins up. Now I'm touching the top of the CPU, which I probably shouldn't have, but I was just making sure it doesn't slide around. Those pins are in where they're supposed to be. So now to secure the CPU, we can just pull the lever back down. It's much easier than an Intel board because this lever is not nearly as spring-loaded. It's more of a crimping action, it feels like. So there we go. Our CPU is now in the motherboard. I'm going to leave things as they are right now for the next week or so. I'm not sure when I'll get the next parts in here because I am doing this project over time, over the course of a couple of paychecks. But Nerd on the Street Money is also helping with this, so thank you to all of our Nerd Club members for helping me build cool systems such as this, because a lot of the storage requirements that I have are due to all the videos that I make. So I'll see you guys in the next clip. It is Wednesday, September 1st, and tonight I'm sitting down to do a little bit more with this NAS build here. It's been a few weeks since I recorded the last clip for this video, and in that time I've gotten a few more parts, not all of them, but at least enough that we can put this thing together, power it on, and make sure that our motherboard and processor and those basic components are working. I'm planning to do 3 things tonight. I'm going to install the cooler into the motherboard, I'm going to install our boot NVMe SSD, and I'm going to unbox the power supply that I received for this thing. After that, we're going to put the motherboard into the case. I'm going to install some loaner RAM that I'm just temporarily using, as well as a loaner graphics card. And with all of those parts installed, we're just going to turn the machine on. We're going to see if we can post, get to the BIOS screen, all of that kind of stuff. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera back down to the desk that I'm looking at. Alright, and this is the motherboard here. So I have had this thing just sitting out. I'm just going to lightly brush off the top of the processor just because I expect some dust had probably settled there in the intervening weeks. I didn't want to get skin oil on it, that's why I used a microfiber cloth. But now we will go ahead and let's unbox our fan here. This is just the integrated cooler that came with the processor that I unboxed in a previous clip. So it looks like the box opens up on the opposite side from the window. I think I did this in the last clip. So we'll just go ahead and take the entire fan assembly out of the box. We've got some plastic on the top that we'll remove. This is interesting. The fan just prominently says AMD, which is cool. You know, obviously it is an AMD build. Trying to remember if my Intel processor, I guess it did say Intel on the included cooler for that one as well. And right here on the bottom of all of that, we do have our pre-applied thermal paste. There actually does appear to be a small particle of dust or something like that on here. So I have just used a small pair of tweezers to get that out of there. I do have thermal paste available, but since we're using the included stock cooler anyway, I don't know if it's worth actually throwing away all of the included thermal paste that they've given us there. So we're just gonna go ahead and go with this. And just comparing the instructions that came with the processor for installing the cooler and the instructions that came with the motherboard, it does look like we'll need to remove these 2 plastic clips that are currently being held on with 4 screws because the heatsink is going to screw on into those same screw holes. So I'll just take my screwdriver here and start unscrewing those. That is very tightly in there, that's for sure. I've just gone and swapped that out for a larger screwdriver head. All right, that one's doing the trick. So we will unscrew 1, 2, and we'll take that plastic clip off. And on the other side, 3, and 4. Okay, and now we do have to decide which way we want to orient this fan. So the motherboard is going to be oriented this way when we put it into the case. So the way that you guys are looking at it, the direction that you're looking at it, that's actually the direction that it's going to appear in. And it does look like I have removed the back plate from the motherboard now. So let me try and set that back on there. So I'm looking at this board from the side, but you guys are looking at it basically in the orientation it will be in when we install it. There's a CPU fan header up here on top of the processor, so we want the wire on our cooler to end up pointing towards the top. I can try plugging it in just to make sure we've got it right here. Yeah, so that wire's not going to wrap around the entire fan. So we're going to want to orient the fan the other direction where the wire is pointing more towards where it's going to plug in there. So we will just gently set the CPU cooler down if we can line up the screw holes here. Okay, and I think those are lined up, so I'm just going to screw those in, starting with the back left here, and we'll just get the The write started. All right, this feels wrong. This doesn't feel right. Let me take another look at our instructions. And there are several different types of heat sinks that are sold for this thing, apparently, or that may be included with this processor, because the instructions have 3 different options. One of the options uses those standoffs. Really, the problem right now is that the cooler isn't quite reaching. There we go. So by holding the plastic brace underneath the motherboard from below, I can kind of pop up the standoffs enough for the screws to reach. So I will go ahead and screw 2 of those in, and then we'll go diagonally to the other 2. Okay. And we'll go with the last screw up here. If we can get that started. All right, so we've got 2 of those fully tightened, 3, and 4. Yeah, so that built-in cooler, it didn't feel great to have to screw in like that. Definitely required a lot of force, but it is on there now. I do think our motherboard is okay. If we look at the back, that's where the back plate is, and that actually feels like metal back here. So I just had to hold that metal plate up so that I could screw in the 4 fan screws. All right, and I am glad I oriented it this way as well, because our RAM slots actually might have been partially obstructed by this AMD logo had I done it the other way around. So I think we made the right decision there. As you can see, the fan wire is a little bit longer than it needs to be. We can almost get the fan wire up into the side of the fan. There we go. So that's a little bit of cable management right there. Yeah, that's not too bad at all. We can almost fold this under. I didn't used to care about cable management at all, but these days I like to try and make things look nice. There we go. Okay, well that's a nice, I just folded the cable under so it's going through this little bit of plastic twice, once the first direction and then back, and then it just plugs into the header. Right there it says CPU fan 1 on the header. It's going to be upside down for you right now if you can see it at all. But yeah, that is our CPU cooler installed, so we should be good to go there. Like I said, if I ever find that the CPU temperature is throttling things, then I'll go ahead and replace this thing. You know, I can get an air cooler from Noctua, or I can get a water cooler from Corsair or any other number of companies. For right now, we just want to get this thing up and running on a low budget. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and put my OS SSD in. So in order to do that, I'm going to remove this M.2 armor plating here. So that's a Phillips screw on the left and one on the right. This entire strip is actually metal. It looks like it might be plastic, but it is actually metal. Aside from the covering over here, over these fan grills, and from the fact that there are fan grills there, you can tell there is actually a very small fan underneath here, which is interesting. Yeah, you can see the fan right there. So this is a metal heat sink, and this heat sink is supposedly going to transfer heat from the M.2 slot right here. It's going to transfer it down to the fan. And actually, looking at this now, I didn't necessarily need to take that off because one of our 2 M.2 slots is not under any sort of heat sink. That one is going to be easier to get to. So now I have a bit of a dilemma about whether or not I actually want to use this heat sink, because I could put this SSD into either one of these slots. One of them will be easier to access and remove later. The other one is going to be better cooled underneath the heatsink. I think I will go ahead and use the heatsink. I might as well, since it's part of this whole thing. I will just have to remember that anyone in the future who's replacing this SSD would need to remove those 2 extra Phillips screws and remove this heatsink. That's going to be stuck to the M.2 SSD with this thermal tape here. And this stuff can be annoying because it does stick to the SSD after being stuck on there and heated for a while, and it can sometimes break while you're pulling it off of the SSD, so you have to kind of be careful. The only reason I'm thinking about how easy it is to access these components is because I might be setting this thing up and leaving it here or in another location with other people while I am traveling. And if that's the case, if something fails while I'm traveling, I do want to be able to sort of walk other people through repairing this thing remotely if I need to. So over here we have a 250 gigabyte Samsung 970 EVO Plus SSD. This is one that I've pulled from one of my other machines. It might not be the SSD that I use in here forever. It is going to be one of the only components in this thing that's not brand new, which is another reason I was hesitant hesitant to put the thermal tape on it, but I am kind of operating on a budget here, as I've said numerous times, and this SSD is perfectly good. If I was going to buy a new SSD for this thing, it would be something cheaper than this 970 EVO Plus. And this SSD that I've got here, the computer that it was being used in is no longer in use, so I certainly don't need it sitting around unused. So we are going to use it here. I am just going to grab my small bag here with an M.2 screw in it. And just to give you a better idea of where this is being installed, if your GPU takes up 2 slots, or even really if it only takes up 1 slot, this top M.2 slot is going to be behind the GPU, which means you need to take the GPU out to access the M.2 drive. You know, this is really, it's just getting more and more complicated using this top slot. I think I'm still gonna go ahead and do it. We won't normally have a GPU in here, but we will need one at least to perform the initial installation. But yeah, I guess we won't need one permanently, and we could theoretically put a GPU in this bottom slot as well, I think. The way the motherboard's wired, we would want to put a GPU in the top normally, because that slot's going to have more bandwidth. Of course, for a server like this, the amount of bandwidth going to and from our GPU isn't really going to matter, since it's going to be entirely headless whenever we're not performing maintenance on it. So I'll go ahead and stick the SSD down here, and we will cross the point of no return. I've already kind of crossed the point of no return with peeling off the backing from that thermal tape. So we will go ahead and place this heatsink on here, just like that, and we will put the 2 screws back into the heatsink to secure it down. Oh, and it appears I've gotten something wrong here, because the screw that I inserted before, the M.2 screw, that does not need to be there. It looks like the screw that holds this heatsink into place is the same one that holds the SSD into place. In fact, the heatsink just holds the SSD down. So it tricked me a little bit there. We can go ahead and stick that down, no harm done. And we will screw in the heatsink up top. And we'll screw it in on the other side as well. So that is our OS drive installed. If I was going to do this build with more funds, I would probably get 2 SSDs of the same type. They would probably still be Samsung drives if I was not worried about budget. When I was considering buying a new drive, maybe 500 gigabytes, a little bit larger than this one, I was looking at Crucial, Western Digital, some brands that are cheaper than Samsung for SSDs. Like I said, I decided to save the money and use a better SSD here that I have anyway. But if I was going to do this build with no funding restrictions, I would get 2 identical SSDs, and I would put them probably into RAID 1 using the motherboard's firmware if possible, because the motherboard does state that it supports RAID. That way, if one of your OS drives goes out, it doesn't kill the entire machine. Now, my actual data is going to be very secure on this machine. Every piece of information will be located on at least 2 hard drives. However, if the OS drive goes out, then I won't be able to access that data until I get a new OS drive, put it in, reinstall the operating system, and reconfigure my mount points and everything that I'm going to set up. So just for that reason, it would be nice to have 2 SSDs just for a little bit of redundancy on that side. Now, I don't think that it's critical that I don't have 2 SSDs, because I have run into problems before where if an M.2 SSD dies, if a PCIe NVMe SSD dies, sometimes the motherboard, depending on your motherboard, it won't even post if a bad SSD is in the machine, depending on how it's failed. So it's possible that I still could have run into the same need to remove a bad OS drive situation, even if I did have dual SSDs. That's one of the other reasons I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to be probably backing up the configuration for the OS from the SSD onto the actual storage pool, and if it ever dies, I'll just need to have somebody replace it or replace it myself before I can access the data again. But for right now, that one SSD should be perfectly sufficient. So I'm going to pull the case forward here, and we're going to try and put the motherboard into the case next. One last little thing, I am going to go ahead and put that M.2 screw that I removed from the packaging but didn't end up needing. I'm going to put it into the motherboard. I like to populate the screw holes for all of my M.2 drives, whether it's in laptops or desktops. And in a laptop, you might not want to do this if you're worried about the screw coming loose and losing it. That's a valid concern if the laptop is shaking around a lot and it could potentially loosen the screw until it falls out. For a desktop though, or a server like this, it's not going to be moving around a ton. If something does fall out, I'm probably going to hear it. And if not, I can always find another M.2 screw. I've got spares, it seems like, actually. I've got 2 more. Which there are only 2 M.2 slots in this machine. Oh, there is a third one up here if you want to add a Wi-Fi card. So I guess that's why they give you 3 M.2 screws. You've got 3 slots. One of the slots doesn't need one of these screws. So they still give you an extra either way, but I guess that's fine. I'm going to keep those handy in case I want or need them later. But yeah, for right now, I'm throwing that extra screw in there just in case, once again, if I have somebody else throwing an SSD in here for me later while I'm not around, I can just say, oh, just use the screw that's already in there, and I don't have to have them dig up wherever I'm going to put this box. All right, and here is our case. Here's the side that the motherboard is going to go into. We do have some cabling in the way that I am going to untwisty tie right now. I will keep the twisty ties handy so that I can use them to re-secure the wires once everything's put together. But for right now, all of the wires are now loose. So I'll turn this back towards you, and I wonder what I can do here to give you a better angle on this. How about if I grab a small box? This was the Fractal Design box from the case. I'll just prop the case up like this. Now you can see into it a little bit easier, and maybe I can work on it easier as well. Now we're going to grab this motherboard and just going to hold it up, adjust the microphone. Sorry if the audio gets wonky while I'm doing the work here, or the video for that matter, but I'm just going to see where this is going to sit. All right, and the correct way to do this is to put the case on its side so that you're actually looking down at the motherboard. Now I want to identify which screws are going to be used for the motherboard, and I think those are going to be screws that shipped with the case. And we do have motherboard standoffs as well, so it's important that we install those. And we have 8 motherboard screws and only 7 standoffs, but that's okay because the bottom left screw hole here, if you can see it, it's already got a standoff pre-applied. I'm using the plastic from the CPU fan to hold all of the screws while I sift through them here and find the right ones. And I'm finding some standoffs. Let me just make sure I know which one of these screw types will go into the standoffs. Yes, so it's the screw type that it's a Phillips screw and it's got sort of a dome-shaped head. See if the camera will focus on that. There you go. So yeah, you can see the top of that screw there, just in case you're following along with this build part by part at home. Oh, some of these screws have pointed ends instead of flat ends, and you definitely don't want to put those into the motherboard, so I'll make sure to not pull those out. You know, I'm pretty sure my previous cases that I've had have had the screws separated out, at least from the standoffs. This kind of having to sort through a big tray of screws to find the right ones is really what Fractal Design makes me think of, is that sort of cumbersome process. This thing will look beautiful when it's all put together, but the actual building it, not the most streamlined experience. Okay, we have all 7 standoffs found, so I'm going to go ahead and put those all in. And of course, I do want to make sure I'm putting the standoffs into the correct screw holes here. So once again, that is why we will hold the motherboard up and check which of the screw holes will actually be used. And as is customary with me building computers, I am hurting myself on the prickly pins on the bottom of the motherboard. Make sure to watch out for those if you're doing your first build. All right, all of those standoffs are in. I did find a screwdriver head to help me tighten those into the case. So now I will switch back to my Phillips screwdriver head, and I'll go ahead and hang this motherboard up inside the case. Oh, but before I do that, I almost forgot. I think the I/O shield needs to be put on from the inside, doesn't it? So here's our I/O shield. It's inside of a plastic bag that's not resealable or anything. We will just tear it open, and the I/O shield looks like we've got some icons to show the I/O on this side, so that's going to be the side facing the outside of the case. On the inside of the I/O shield, we've got some padding, which is interesting. I don't normally see that, but we do have, you can see some little metal prongs and things sticking up to help it better grasp onto the motherboard. So the 3 audio ports will be on the bottom, and I'll go ahead and pop this in to the I/O shield cutout. All right, that wasn't too bad at all. I/O shield is in. You can see it a little bit if I rotate the case here. And now I'm going to go ahead and set the case down. I am going to put the motherboard in from the top. I trust that you all know how to screw Phillips screws in. So I know you won't be able to see this as well, but this has already been cumbersome enough so far. And there are all 8 screws screwed in. So with the power of movie magic, I can now tilt the case back down, and there's a motherboard in it now. So that is great. That's exactly what we wanted to see. And this is starting to feel more like a real build now. I've had these parts, like I said, sitting on the desk for so long. Great to have the motherboard actually installed. And a nice little fan there as well over the processor. So next, we've got a few more pieces that need to go in. Before we flip this thing around, I guess I'll go ahead and put in the temporary parts that I've got. Now for the RAM in this thing, I am going to order some RAM. This motherboard takes ECC RAM, and of course for a NAS, I'm going to want to use ECC RAM, and I'm going to want to basically fill this thing up. Like I said, I'm using these temporary parts just to check that this machine is working so far, because if I need to do any warranty stuff with any of the parts that I put together, I don't want it to happen months later. And it is going to take me another few weeks at least to get that RAM because I am working around when I get my paychecks here. So in the meantime, I'm just going to insert one single stick of this HyperX RAM. This is a 16GB stick of RAM, and the RAM that I'm looking at to actually put in here permanently is going to be 32GB sticks. But this is ECC RAM. It is unregistered, so it should work in this machine. The one thing you have to be careful with when you're putting ECC RAM into a consumer motherboard with a consumer processor is that it supports ECC, but it does not support registered ECC. It only supports unbuffered ECC RAM. But like I said, this is unbuffered, so it should work perfectly fine. And I have just consulted the motherboard manual. It looks like for a single stick of RAM, we want to put it in the second to left slot. Channel A slot 2 is what it recommends for whatever reason. So we will just throw that in there. This motherboard's RAM slots do click on both sides, which is nice. A lot of motherboards these days are fixed on one side and they only click on the other, but it's easier to insert the RAM with this type of slot where there's a latch on either side. So that's our temporary RAM. Hopefully it will be enough to let us post. And next we've got a GPU. Now once again, this GPU doesn't even belong to me. I just happen to have it in the apartment right now, so I'm throwing it in here for like 20 minutes just to make sure that the machine powers on and posts. Now for a NAS, a headless NAS, the GPU is basically at the bottom of my list of priorities. Now like I said, I could have sacrificed 1/10 of a gigahertz of clock speed and gotten a processor that supported integrated graphics and not had to worry about a GPU at all. But graphics are so unimportant to me on this system, I didn't even want to make that compromise. You know, I wanted the processor to be the best at processing as it could be for the price. And for the graphics card, all that I need is something that will let me get to a terminal in an emergency, basically, or for the 5 or 10 minutes it will take me to install an SSH server on this thing. I'm not even planning on installing a GUI and setting up VNC. I thought about doing all of that, but really I can do everything I need to do on this machine over SSH. I can do all the setup over SSH, and I can get my network shares set up and my web applications running and do whatever I need to do without having a graphical environment. So I'm honestly planning on attempting to put my GeForce 8400 GS in here. Now, if you've been watching the channel for a long time, you might remember when I built my first ever computer in the summer of 2012, 9 years ago. That GPU was a piece of junk. It couldn't even run all desktop environments at the time. I mean, everything on Linux it was actually okay at, but I remember trying to do a Hackintosh, and that GPU could not handle the AppGrid icon launcher on Mac OS at the time. I eventually upgraded that computer to a GTX 650 Ti boost, and that's still what's in the computer now. Now, both the original 8400 GS and that 650 Ti boost are in St. Louis, Missouri right now. They're not anywhere near where I am. So I'm going to have somebody visiting me in the next month or so, and I'm going to see if I can have them bring me one or both of those GPUs. The GPUs are old enough, I'm thinking they should be supported by NoView, and I don't need great performance, you know, just for a terminal, literally just a TTY, NoView should actually be sufficient. You know, the driver, the open source reverse engineered NVIDIA driver, it's called Nouveau, but I refer to it as NoView, one, because I'm terrible at pronouncing words, but two, because it often doesn't even work at all. And when it does, you're missing lots of acceleration, you're missing really a lot of the value that you would get out of NVIDIA hardware by installing their proprietary driver. I'm not planning on installing the NVIDIA proprietary driver in this thing. Even if I did, I'm pretty sure even that newer 650 Ti boost would no longer be supported by that proprietary driver. I would have to use a legacy version of their proprietary driver. But I'm not planning on doing that. Like I said, I'm planning on throwing something in here that is old enough to use with NoView, just on the off chance that I ever need to have somebody plug into it to see what's going on if it's not working. But for today, I've got this dual slot card. This is an RTX something or other. I'm not even actually sure off the top of my head. It's Gigabyte brand. So we're gonna throw that into this machine. Fortunately, the PCI covers here the empty white slots that you can see there. They're all held in by screws. So some cheaper cases, including some older Fractal design cases, actually had PCI covers that you tore out. You tore the metal off of the case, and once you took it out, you couldn't really put it back in again. This case is a little bit nicer. It at least has screws on each of these, so my 8400 GS graphics card, I'm pretty sure it's only a single slot, so I'll be able to put the second slot that I'm about to remove back in to cover up that hole when I do eventually put that second card in. These placeholder slots, they do have little notches in them anyway, so it's not like they need to be airtight, but you want the case to look nice. You don't want huge gaps in it. So I will go ahead and unscrew the top two PCI slot covers. There's the first one, and there's the second one. Boy, it would be great if I had some help for a video like this. That's made other build videos go better in the past. All right, I'll fish those two screws out of there that I just dropped, and we will put this graphics card in. We'll just raise up all the other cables. And this is once again not cooperating, so I'm going to tilt it so that I can see why this card would not be sliding in. Okay, and the GPU, one of the brackets was a little bit out of alignment, so I've just corrected that. And the GPU is now installed. So finally, I'm going to turn this entire case around. Hopefully we haven't scratched the back up too much. Oh, that looks like it's pretty okay. And in this Amazon box, I mentioned in a previous clip that I was gonna start going with Amazon instead of Newegg after they botched that delivery. So in this Amazon box, we've got an EVGA Supernova 850 T2 power supply. Now I went with this power supply for one simple reason. It is a titanium rated power supply. I have never paid attention to ratings on PSUs before, but for this machine, since it's going to be on 24/7, I wanted to try and make it as energy efficient as possible. Now the hard drives, they're going to be enterprise class hard drives, so they might not be the most energy efficient hard disks that you can find. I'm going to have a lot of RAM in this thing. It's not going to be sleeping. It's not going to go into suspend. So the machine as a whole isn't super energy friendly, but the power supply is one place that I was able to optimize. I spent a little bit more money on the PSU to get a titanium rated power supply. Now, if you look at the different levels of power supplies, there's bronze, silver, gold, titanium, maybe one more in there that I'm forgetting. The higher a power supply is rated in its energy efficiency, the more power it tends to save, particularly at lower usage levels. Since this thing is a NAS and it's not going to be doing a lot of computing most of the time that it's on, titanium that's got both decent efficiency at higher usage levels and also good efficiency at lower usage levels is perfect for this as a server. This was the cheapest, the least expensive titanium rated power supply that I could find that was from a name brand. EVGA is a known power supply company. There were a couple that were cheaper, but they were from no-name brands. The top of the plastic wrap was already ripped here, so that's great sign. That's exactly why I wanted to see if all of this works today. So we will peel off all of that plastic wrap. And it's nice that they put a handle on the top of the power supply box. This is a very nice box for a PSU. There is some tape here, some EVGA labeled tape that we do need to cut before we can go any further. Fortunately, I have my knife here from when I was using the tweezers earlier. So we will open up a blade and we will slice that tape. And we can pull that flap open. So on the back here, we've got a lot of text in various languages about the features of this PSU. It is fully modular, so we won't need to leave any cables in there that aren't actively being used. I'll probably leave the GPU cables in there, but anything else that we don't need, we won't have. The power supply is 850 watts, as you can tell from the name. 94% efficiency, it says just on its headline there. And 850 watts I'm thinking is going to be perfectly sufficient for this machine. I did look up the numbers on how much power hard drives will draw, and really they don't draw all that much power. They do draw more than an SSD, especially when they're first spinning up when you turn the computer on, but they don't draw as much as something like a graphics card. So there are a lot of higher capacity power supplies out there that are much higher than 850 watts. You can see the T2 series here on this cardboard. It says they've got it in 750, 850, 1000, and 1200, but the 1000 and the 1200 options, those are more for people who are using fancy GPUs, maybe even more than one GPU, and they need a lot of power throughput to power those GPUs. I do not need that. All that I need this thing to do is power some hard drives, so I think this will be great. We do have a cloth bag here that you can put all of your extra cables in. The cables just all come inside of this partitioned section of the cardboard box here by default, and we can set that back in, and we can pull out the other side, which is the power supply itself inside of another cloth case. Man, power supplies, this isn't the first time I've seen some really nice power supply packaging. Really well done packaging. Hopefully the power supply actually works well, but yeah, that's great packaging on EVGA's part, very high quality. So this is probably going to be the bottom. This is where the fan is, and on the back here, we've got all of the places where we can plug in the cables. Like I said, this is fully modular, so nothing is hardwired in here. We plug in each individual item that we need this power supply to power. And on the other side, this is what's going to display out the back of our case. Interesting design. It is really edge to edge, very small bezel on the honeycomb mesh there. And you can see the coil in there that you do not want to touch under any circumstances. And here we have a switch for the entire machine. That is a nice, very substantial feeling switch too. We do have an eco mode switch on the other side. I'm probably going to keep that turned on. I do have some experience with EVGA GPUs, and what I've heard is that eco mode, it does nothing, absolutely nothing for the amount of power that can be supplied, but it uses a more optimal fan curve that's quieter and also obviously saves power, as the name eco mode suggests. So it might run a little bit warmer, but yeah, I'll probably keep that turned on in general. This side of the case is going to be very well cooled anyway, considering it won't have any GPUs in it long term or anything like that. At least not any very big ones anyway. So that's that. That is the power supply. If I eventually get enough hard drives to populate this second bay, which I'm anticipating eventually, very far down the line I will, then I might experiment with turning eco mode off and seeing if it improves temperatures at all. But for right now, I think we should be fine. So I'm going to take this box off of the desk here, and I'm going to bring our case just a little bit closer, try not to knock the power supply off the desk. And in typical PC building fashion, I'm struggling to get some good angles here. But we are going to set the power supply down once again with the fan facing the bottom. The stickers are oriented such that you can have it flipped either direction and the stickers will be facing upright. But if I take a look at the power supply's manual, it does recommend placing it with the fan facing down. It is probably an intake fan as well. So we will do what they're recommending. Just flip it around so that the part that needs to plug into the wall is facing out of the case so it can do that. And we've got that power supply sort of in place. I'm once again going to dig out 4 power supply screws from our motherboard screw tray here. And I'm guessing that they are going to look very similar to the motherboard screws. They might be a little bit more hexagonal in shape, although I've got a lot that just look like the motherboard screws, and I honestly think that those might be what I'm looking for here. Oh, nope, never mind. I found the hexagon ones I was thinking of. So a power supply screw, I don't know what the deal is with power supplies and hexagons, but you'll typically find that the ventilation on the back of a power supply is cut in a hexagon pattern, and the screw is also going to be, well, the hexagon on the head, as you can see, maybe. So let me just look for 4 of those real quick, now that I know they exist. Okay, and we have 4 hexagon-shaped screws here. So we do need to sort of hold the power supply up to the case while we are screwing it in. That is fairly normal, and we will make sure we use the correct screw holes for the orientation of the power supply that we are going with. Basically, we're making sure that we're screwing into screw holes and not into fan grill meshes. So in our case, the top right here, instead of an actual full screw hole in the case, it's more of a partial cutout. And then at the top left, we've got 2 different screw holes to choose from, and we'll go with the one that is further in. All right, so that is the power supply there. I'm running low on camera space tonight, and I do want to do a good job wiring this case up. And wiring is pretty boring to watch in my opinion. You don't want to see me struggling to get wires and cables through all of this case. You just want to see the nice, pretty finished product. So I'm going to take all of this, and I'm going to wire up the motherboard, processor, and GPU right now. And I'll let you know when I'm ready to turn this thing on for a power on self-test, I guess. All right, guys, and here we are. You can see I've got the case here in a very, very temporary wire management setup. I've got cables going over the top of the case just to keep them out of the CPU fan, some of those fan cables on the other side. And the cable management I will fix up later. For right now, it is getting very late. It's still a weeknight. I just want to I want to power this thing on and see if we post, if all of the hardware that's in there so far is detected. All right, so I just flipped the power switch. I saw a little bit of a flicker in the lights in the room, and I'm going to power this thing on. It is plugged into the same power supply as my own personal desktop, so hopefully that doesn't trip any breakers, but we're gonna power this thing on, and I've got a keyboard plugged into it. We'll see if we can get into a BIOS. We have a power LED. Fans are all starting to spin up. Okay, and this is a great sign. Absolutely great sign. So we've got a BIOS screen. We can see our BIOS version at the top. We've got our processor, 3300X, that is detected. We've got our borrowed RAM stick detected out of the 4 slots there. Now, as you can see on the hardware monitor page, there are 3 chassis fan slots. None of them are plugged in right now because the fan splitter that comes with this Fractal design case had its own fan controller board that is plugged into a SATA power cable directly into the power supply. So I don't think that that board actually reads any temperatures. At any rate, it's probably just setting those 3 fans to the same speed. Now, I might get a 4th chassis fan to provide some input airflow on the hard drive side, but if I don't do that, then I might just drop the fan splitter from the setup and plug the 3 fans directly into the motherboard, since it has 3 ports for them anyway, and I obviously need all of the SATA power cables I can get out of this power supply here. But if I come over to the advanced page, inside of the storage configuration section, we can see that our Samsung 970 EVO Plus is detected as well. So that's everything that I needed to do today. It was a lot of work, but I really did need to make sure that the parts that I had ordered, the motherboard, the CPU, the case, all that stuff was expensive. And then the power supply, that's all the stuff that I've brought in, plus that other SSD that was in there that was in another machine. I wanted to make sure all of the new parts worked and that they all worked together. And it looks like they are. So that is brilliant. So I will see you guys in the next clip, probably in a few more weeks, when I've got some additional hardware to throw into this thing.